One Piece lore is out of this world right now, and I have so many thoughts, so we just have to get straight into it. But actually, you know what? Before we begin, before I forget, please take a second to subscribe to the channel. 2025 will be the year that we reach 100,000 subscribers on JoyGirl, and I need your help to get there. So please, I'd really appreciate it. Please subscribe if you're not subscribed already. Okay, so chapter 1136 gave us so much lore, and it's actually taken me quite a bit of time to process it all. I'm not even sure that I've quite processed everything 100%, but I'm gonna do my best. So let me share some of the connections, some of the interpretations I've made so far. Starting with the information that the world has been destroyed in the past, not once, but twice. And each time this has happened, Nika or a Nika figure has been somehow involved. Now, I think we can safely assume that one of these times is probably referring to the Void Century and referring to Joy Boy as the Nika figure. We already know from Vegapunk that Joy Boy was involved in this massive war, the massive flooding, the one that caused the then present world to sink, and so I think that's all pretty straightforward, doesn't need much explaining. So really, all the mystery and the intrigue, that centers around this other time, the other time that the world was destroyed. And immediately my head went to the Age of Heaven. So in case you forgot, or in case you didn't know, the One Piece world can be split into two ages. There's the Age of the Sea Circle, which is the period that we are currently in, and events as far back as the Void Century are all said to have taken place during this Age of the Sea Circle, because we're told that the Age of Sea Circle came about 1500 years ago. Whereas the period before that, the Age of Heaven, well, this period, this age, this era is actually a bit of a mystery. In fact, it's even a mystery as to whether this period is real or not, whether it really happened. And the reason I say this is because we were introduced to the Age of Heaven during the Arabasta arc. So we find out about the Age of Heaven when Robin is reading, or should I say, pretending to read, so-called reading, the poneglyph to Crocodile, but instead of really reading the material or really reading what that poneglyph says, where it actually does contain information about Pluton, instead she's just talking about events that took place during the Age of Heaven, and all of these events seem to center around the history about the Arabasta kingdom. And because we know that she was actually lying, because she admitted later on that she was lying, it's always been a bit of a question mark as to whether the Age of Heaven is in fact real or not. Did the Age of Heaven actually ever really exist? Now, personally, I've always been inclined to believe that it is real. I mean, why else would Oda include this sort of lore, include these sort of details or information if it didn't have any basis at all? I think the way that I've always interpreted this scene is that Robin is just sprouting off other information that she knows. You know, maybe she came across the information about Arabasta's kingdom, about its history during her days as one of the Yoharan scholars, or maybe because she's a history nerd, she just went off on her own solo adventures when she was operating as part of the Baroque works, which we know she usually does. We've seen her do it even with the Straw Hats. She's just gone off on her own and found out more about Arabasta history, and now because she didn't actually want to tell Crocodile the truth about Pluton, she just pulled this information out, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the Age of Heaven is false. Anyways, because this is the only information about another age, another period, another era that is said to have existed that we've ever been told about, I am inclined to think that this is the most obvious answer, or at least the most obvious connection we can make with this new information. That Nika was alive during this great heaven age, and that he was somehow, or he or she was somehow involved with the destruction of this great era. And if that's true, if you think about it, it's kind of crazy that Oda might have even been thinking about Nika lore all the way back from the Arabasta arc. And I think that's actually certainly plausible that Oda was planning to introduce us to this legendary figure all the way back from so early on in the series, had even thought about, you know, the age, the era in which this legendary Nika lived and breathed. But also, something else that I find really cool, and something that this new information sparked off in my brain, is something that I hadn't really considered before, and that concerns Imu. If there was a second destruction of the world, or if the Void Century was the second destruction of the world, has Imu been alive? Has Imu been present or been in existence since the Age of Heaven? Was Imu actually a friend or a foe, or at least an acquaintance of the original Nika? Because again, the fact that Imu and Joy Boy's paths crossed, that they were aware of each other during the Void Century, I think that much is pretty clear. I mean, we even saw Imu physically reacting, I guess you could say, actually recognizing Joy Boy's presence, Joy Boy's will, when Emmett blasted that massive massive Haki attack of Joy Boys at the end of the Egghead Island arc. And even before then, we saw that Ivankov was heavily suggesting that Imu has been around since the Void Century, that he's part of the Neurona family that existed prior to the Void Century, or during the Void Century days. So again, I think that much is pretty straightforward. But now that we know more about Nika, the fact that there is this original sun god deity figure potentially linked to the Age of Heaven, and because it also seems like we're stuck in this cycle of destruction, a global cycle of destruction, where there has been a Nika moment at each critical juncture, I wonder whether Imu has also been a critical figure. And in which case, is Imu similar to Nika, just a respawn? You know, in the same way that there have been different versions of the Nika deity. There's the original Nika, there's Joy Boy, and now there's Luffy. Is that the same thing with Imu? Or because we know, or it seems that Imu of the present is the same Imu of Joy Boy's history, has Imu been alive since the Age of Heaven? And now that we're speaking of cycles, what I also think is quite important to this introduction, or to the heavy lean in to this cyclical history idea, is that I think it actually could be very well an interpretation of our real world history, because some people actually believe that our real world history is also cyclical. And I'm not quite sure if I fully believe that our world history is necessarily cyclical always, but I do definitely agree with that saying history repeats itself, because I think the way that I've always interpreted that is that history repeats itself when we don't learn from history, when we don't make the changes that we need to pave a better path, or to pave a new path. And I think that this might apply to what's happening here in One Piece history. For me, it seems that the One Piece world has gone through these cycles of world destruction, where it's involved different iterations of the same Nika figure, primarily for this reason. The One Piece world hasn't actually managed to fix what is the crux of the problem, what is truly wrong with the world yet. And I think this is really important because it's also linked to another piece of lore that we got in chapter 1136, and that's about the dual characteristic, or the different characteristics that can be attributed to Nika, whether Nika is a liberator or whether he's a destroyer. But actually, before we get into that, I want to pose another question. I do have a question about the cyclical history. If the One Piece world really is stuck in a cycle, what makes this version, what makes our present different? You know, what makes this occasion, what makes this period of history, this iteration of the cycle special? Because surely the answer can't be that in another 1,000 years time, in another 800, 900 years, we're just gonna have another scenario where the world is gonna get destroyed again because we're gonna have another Nika figure. I don't know what comes after L, like Hey, Kufi, because we have Kufi, who's the next iteration of Nika in a One Piece 2.0, and this Kufi is going to have to destroy the world all over again. I mean, I think we all know that that can't be it. The whole point about the story that we're reading, the story that we're following on Luffy's journey so far, is that Luffy is going to be the figure that breaks the cycle. He breaks the cycle and he's going to definitively get the path of history straight. And then that means I think we can get back to that question. Is Nika the warrior of liberation, or is Nika the warrior of destruction? Is he the warrior of laughter? Because I think that's closely related. And to that question of how do we understand Nika, how do we interpret Nika, which of these qualities, which of these characteristics are actually Nika, I think my follow-up question, or I guess my response to that, would have to be ¿Por qué no los dos? Or I guess if we're gonna be really accurate, I should say ¿Por qué no los tres? But I don't think that quite has the same ring to it. What I mean is, why can't Nika be the liberator as well as the destroyer as well as the warrior of laughter? I really like this ambiguous element, this ambiguous quality to Nika's character that has been newly introduced to us in this chapter. I think it's just so perfect and really in line with a lot of the other elements of the series, and I don't even know if I have quite the right words to express how much I enjoy reading this, because in some ways it's so simple, but I think there's actually so many layers and so much meaning to this Nika figure being so unclear and being so open to interpretation. On one hand, it's that classic idea of two sides of the same coin that we know Oda loves so much and has already implemented into his work. And the way that I see it, I do say two sides because I know there's also this idea of Nika the laughter warrior, but the laughing god, whether you interpret Nika as the savior, or you recognize him as the terror of destruction. I think in either case, Nika would always be laughing. Nika and all his successors, they're all just crazy individuals, and whether they're doing actions of salvation or destruction, they're probably just really enjoying themselves in that moment and having a laugh. You know, no matter how serious the battles they're involved in, no matter how high the stakes, they're just constantly laughing, constantly enjoying themselves. I mean, think back to Luffy during the Kaido fight, especially after he unlocked his Nika qualities. So I think it does boil down to these two dichotomous interpretations: the god of liberation or the god of destruction. And I use that word interpretation quite specifically because I do think that this is a case of misguided interpretation. I think when Nika's believers or Nika's followers view him as solely the god of liberation or solely the deity of destruction, I think that's a case of misguided interpretation, because the way I see it, I think the savior Nika and the destructive Nika are one and the same. Nika is both a destroyer and a liberator. These two roles come hand in hand, and Nika can't be just one or the other. If we follow Luffy's story so far, his character arc has been someone who has liberated those who are oppressed, but in doing so, in order to achieve that sort of freedom for others, he's had to destroy the current systems, the current forces that be, in order to free those who are shackled by oppression. He's had to destroy in order to liberate. And really, at the end of the day, aren't we actually waiting for him to do that very thing? Aren't we waiting for him to destroy Marijois? We want him to destroy the class system that exists, the class structure. We want him to destroy the power structure of Imu and the world government. And we see this destruction as necessary in order for the entire world to be free. There's also the popular theory of the red line itself having to be destroyed, and that's how the whole world is also going to be free. And so then this makes me wonder whether this archetype or this understanding of Nika as a liberator or a destroyer also has to do with why Joy Boy and why Nika have presumably failed, why they haven't really been able to set the path of history straight, why we're stuck in cycles. And it goes back to my question earlier about, so then what makes Luffy different? What makes this iteration of the cycle special or different? Maybe it has to do with how Luffy will be able to break the cycle once and for all, because he's able to harness both the qualities of liberator and destroyer. For example, maybe the original Nika figure focused too much on his liberating qualities, on freeing people, didn't engage in necessary destruction. Whereas maybe Joy Boy focused too much on the ancient weapons, harnessing the powers, the technology of the ancient kingdom, focused too much on destruction. So those were some of the immediate thoughts that I had, but I did say I think this ambiguity actually has multiple layers. So another thing that I really quite liked about this idea of Nika both being the liberator and the destroyer is that I quite liked how Oda has framed this. He's framed it as if it's a misunderstanding about who Nika truly is due to a poor interpretation of ancient sacred texts. So in chapter 1136, we're introduced to this idea of the Harley, and I wasn't quite sure about how to translate Harley. I didn't really know what Harley meant, but then someone during the reaction stream said that it could actually be a play on the word holy. Maybe it's a way that holy can be pronounced. So Harley is apparently written in this ancient archaic script, so it's not readily accessible, meaning that it's difficult for the Elbathians to read and translate or interpret what it's actually trying to say about Nika. And what I really like about this is that this seems like Oda is drawing quite heavily on real life mythology, on our interpretation of our human society's interpretation of ancient mythology, and in particular real life Norse mythology. So I have discussed the importance of Norse mythology not just for the arc of Elbaf, but for all the future events in One Piece more generally, and I do highly recommend you go check that out. But a critical thing, or something really interesting and really important about Norse mythology, is that it is originally an oral tradition. And I guess that same thing could be said to a lot of religions and a lot of ancient mythologies. The Bible, for example, was only transcribed, centuries after the events that are said to have taken place. But what's really interesting about Norse mythology is that when Norse mythology was actually documented in the written language, by this point, so many of its stories had changed over the years for many reasons. Maybe it's the case that, the stories just change as it gets passed down through generation, but also these changes occurred because of new influences. So one of the first documenters who actually put Norse mythology down onto paper was a man named Snorri Sturluson. And Sturluson is actually said to have been Christian, which meant that when he was transcribing and when he was writing Norse mythology, Sturluson actually imbued a lot of Christian influences into the way that he wrote the traditional Norse mythology. He's written these traditional Norse stories in a way that fits the Christian worldview. There's also a secondary influence in the way that these Norse mythology were written down, and that also has to do with the form in which they were written. So Sturluson's most well-known works are probably the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda, or at least Sturluson is widely believed to have written these texts. But when we focus on the Poetic Edda, this is a collection of old Norse tales that is written in the poetic form. It's a narrative poem, meaning that it's a poem that tells a narrative story. It's also been written in alliterative verse, and that's a form of poetic verse where it uses alliteration as the main device. It's the main device that creates a poem's metrical structure. And this is really interesting because it's widely believed that some of the words that were used in Poetic Edda, they weren't used necessarily for their accuracy because they were the best way to describe what is believed in ancient Norse mythology, but these words were used because of the poetic effect that it would have, the way that it would contribute and add to that alliterative structure. And what that means is that it obviously makes it really difficult to take away a 100 accurate interpretation of the Norse tales. Apart from the fact that the stories themselves have changed so much from their original conception, even when it's written down, we don't actually know what some of these words are thought to have meant because it's written in an older language, it's written in an older archaic form of the Icelandic language, but also because we don't know whether some words were used just to add that poetic flavor, just to add to that poetic effect. And that's something that I've always thought really interesting about Norse mythology, but it seems like Oda might have even included this element as well and has added this to the Elbathians' confusion and their understanding about their own Nika mythology. I guess it also quite closely resembles the different ways in which a religion can be interpreted in our real world as well. For example, all the Abrahamic religions believe in the same God, but they have vastly different interpretations about the different prophets, namely Jesus, what Jesus meant. When I read chapter 1136, I was also immediately reminded of the way that religion is portrayed in Game of Thrones or the Song of Ice and Fire series by George R.R. Martin. So in case you're not familiar, one of the predominant religions in that series is this idea of the faith of the seven. It's centered on this idea that there is one God, but this one God has 7 different faces, or they have 7 different attributes, 7 different elements. There is, the mother, the more nurturing one, the father, the protector. There is the warrior, we've got the maiden, we've got the smith, the crone, and so on and so forth. I was also prompted to look up Joseph Campbell during the stream as well. So Joseph Campbell wrote a popular book known as The Hero of a Thousand Faces, and here he talks about his theory that across different mythological cultures, across the different ancient cultures, it seems like a lot of ancient mythology, a lot of religions share a fundamental structure. He comes up with this idea of the monomyth, an archetypal hero's journey. And I guess it does go back to this idea of comparative mythology. One figure can be interpreted in multiple different ways, which is exactly what we have in the case of Nika. But I think another way, another dimension, or another layer that we can add to this Nika the Destroyer, Nika the Liberator, goes all the way back to the Sabaody Archipelago arc. It goes all the way back to the comments that Rayleigh made. You guys know which one I'm talking about. It's when he's talking about what the Straw Hats will find at Laugh Tale, and he tells them, you guys might come to a different conclusion to the one that we came to. You guys might interpret things differently. You're going to have to decide for yourself what this all means. And maybe this is what Rayleigh was talking about back then. Maybe Luffy and the Straw Hats are going to have to decide, was Joy Boy a liberator or was he a destroyer? Did Nika, did Joy Boy, did they make the right choice? Is the way that they faced or the way that they actioned world destruction right or wrong? And when it comes to Luffy's time, will Luffy make the right choice? I guess in that same way, this could explain why Vegapunk also said that it wasn't his place to judge who was right and who was wrong when he's talking about the Void Century. He says he can't assess the right or wrong in this situation. Maybe it's because he can't tell whether Joy Boy was a liberator or whether he was a destroyer. And I think this distinction could actually even be important when we think about the would-be Joy Boys throughout One Piece history. You know, the failed Joy Boys of One Piece history. Some individuals leaned in too much in the destruction. You know, in Kaido's case, his will and his destiny was all about destruction and world domination. Didn't lean into the liberating qualities of Nika enough. Which is also interesting because it seems to have a huge relevance to the future of Elbaf as well, because it seems like there is a bit of conflict, or at least a bit of tension about whether Elbaf should remain Warland Elbaf, or whether they should follow in King Harold's footsteps and just become peaceful, should open themselves up to the rest of the world. That seems very much tied up to the whole liberator versus destroyer debate. And I guess obviously in the case of Loki, it might be a clear indication why Loki isn't the sun god. He can't be the Nika of today's generation, not just because Luffy has the Nika Devil Fruit, but because Loki doesn't embrace the liberating qualities of Nika enough. Or maybe it's the opposite. Maybe it's actually, this is Oda's way to show us that Loki actually does understand the nuance of Nika. Because maybe we could even see that he has actually a deeper understanding of what it means to be a sun god. You know, for example, his conversation with Mosa in chapter 1135. We see that he has this desire to free his friend from the trouble that they've experienced, but in order to do so, he knows that he wants to beat them up. He wants to beat up Mosa's tormentors, liberation and destruction. Or even if you view his actions, the way that he responded to the God's Knights in chapter 1136, the fact that he refuses to join the Knights, even though it would mean his own liberation, which is what he wants, because he knows that that would mean becoming a Celestial Dragon, and Celestial Dragons are pretty much the antithesis of liberation. They are the opposite of freedom. Although with that all being said, I would have to say that Loki probably has misunderstood Nika, or at least that he does focus quite heavily on the destruction, the destructive capabilities or the destructive characteristics of Nika, especially with the further information about Loki's childhood that we got in chapter 1136. And we've also seen him state multiple times, all he repeats is that he's gonna destroy the world, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, as I keep saying, but it does seem like he is leaning in very heavily into the destruction, or Nika as the destroyer. But just a quick side note about Loki. Even with this further information that we got about Loki's character, all of the things he did from a very young age, despite all of this, doesn't this all seem very much like an Odin introduction? Doesn't it feel very familiar? I mean, if you remember back to the Wano arc, Odin was also described to be this bad terror. He was a terrorizer that caused so much harm to Wano. He was a menace. He caused mischief wherever he went. And in fact, it got so bad that Odin actually had to be disowned by his father, by the Shogun. But we also know that at the end of the day, Odin was a good guy. He was the chaddest of chads. That is exactly the same vibe that I'm getting from Loki right now, especially after he refused to join the Holy Knights. And if you guys have been watching my videos, then you guys also will know that I never believed for a second that Loki was an evil guy. And I would highly recommend you to go watch that video, or to go rewatch that video if you've forgotten, because I do think the more information we get about Loki, the more confident I'm feeling about how I've assessed Loki's character. And I'm not trying to say that Loki is purely good, because I think that also wouldn't be quite nuanced enough. All I'm saying is that I don't think he's quite evil, and I do think there is some sort of misunderstanding here. And because now we also have new information, we have a further dimension or further layers to Loki's character, because Jirul says that he thinks the reason why Loki killed his own father also has to do with how he's interpreted Nika. The fact that Loki also wants to become the next sun god. So I'm assuming that what this means is that Loki and King Harold had different interpretations about what Nika meant, about who Nika represented. Harold might have believed in only the liberating qualities of Nika, whereas Loki, again, believed too much in the destroying, the destructive capabilities. And for that reason, Harold didn't want to give away the devil fruit that may have some sort of solar-based powers, or maybe is powerful enough to make Loki the next deity. He didn't want to give Loki the devil fruit because he knew that Loki would use it purely for destruction, or he thought that he would use it only for destruction. In which case, I'd have to say that they were both wrong, as well as both right, or both half wrong and half right. Again, the true quality of Nika is that he is both the liberator and the destroyer. But I still stand by that Loki fought Harold as per the Elbathian code. I still believe that it wasn't a straight up murder like the Elbathians seem to believe. I think that King Harold and Loki were settling their dispute in the honorable Elbathian way, and maybe there's a bit of a misunderstanding, or maybe because this is a nuanced character, maybe Loki did actually use some underhanded tactics, and that would make him not straight up good. Anyways, like I said, go watch that video about Loki. So I got a bit sidetracked there, so let's take a step back. Let's go back to Nika, because we got a new silhouette in chapter 1136. We got some new details, and although it's really similar to the silhouette that we got when he was first introduced via Who's Who back at Wano, there are obviously new details in this drawing of Nika, and we have to discuss it. So the first thing that I noticed was that Nika is painted dark, painted black, but then it might not mean anything because a few panels later, Loki is also shown as straight up black when he's shown as a silhouette in the flashbacks, so maybe it doesn't mean all that much, but I do have to say he looks quite much like Shandorian in this depiction, but then his armor, the shield, that matches the sigil that we've seen on the Kozuki crest. And this goes back to some ideas that I've discussed and that I've had for a while, but I haven't fully gotten around to 100% yet. There's something really important, there's something really huge that I haven't quite been able to figure out of the connection between the specific races or the specific humanoid species and the specific families that Oda has chosen as Joy Boy's allies. You know, the Shandorians, the Fishmen, the Buccaneers, the Kozuki family, so on and so forth. I feel like we're almost there. It's just at the tip of our tongue, but I just can't crack it quite yet. But I do feel like we're close, so if you have any ideas, then please let me know. In the meantime, I would also highly recommend you to go check out this video that I made based on Mr. Bushido's theory about Joy Boy actually having been one of the Kozuki family members, because I think it's quite relevant now that we have the symbolism on Nika's shield which matches the Kozuki crest. You know, is it a case that the original Nika was a Shandorian, Joy Boy is part of the Kozuki family? In which case, what makes Luffy special? Why, you know, what is special about the monkey family? Is it because it is the monkey family and monkeys are closely related to the evolution of the human species? Look, like I said, I haven't quite wrapped my head around it all yet. But do go watch that video and let me know if it sparks any inspiration for you. Otherwise, I've also made another video about the importance of the sun god across real life mythologies or real life religions. And I do think that's also going to be really important for the series going forward. So go check out that video as well. I'll add the links to all of these videos in the description below, so please go check them out. In the meantime, let me know what you think about anything that we've discussed so far, anything we've discussed today, any ideas that you have on the sun god, because I'd love to hear it. Also, there's so much more to do with chapter 1136 that we could just spend ages and ages talking about. Haven't even gotten to the Holy Nights yet, but I am gonna leave it here for today. So thank you as always for listening to another one of my ramblings. Again, if you're not subscribed, please do so. You can please also like and share the video. And if you'd like to support the channel further, you can also become a Patreon or channel member like these wonderful people whose names are appearing on the screen right now. But as always, thank you just for being here. I can't wait to discuss more One Piece with you. So this is JoyGirl, and I'll see you again soon.